There was a case in my career that completely changed the way I see forensic medicine. An elderly man was found in his home. It seemed like just another natural death, with no obvious signs of violence or criminal activity. But a small, barely visible fingerprint, almost imperceptible, was the key to uncovering a truth no one expected. That tiny, forgotten print revealed a secret that changed the entire course of the investigation. Before we start, let me know in the comments where you're watching this video from, so I can see how far it has reached. I am Dr. Mauricio Cardenas, a forensic doctor in Medellin, Colombia. I have been in the city for 38 years and have spent more than a decade studying every detail that the human body can tell after death. Every case has its story, but this one in particular taught me a deep lesson about patience and precision. It was an ordinary day at the Legal Medicine Institute. We received the body of a 72-year-old man, found by a relative in the living room of his modest house. At first glance, it looked like a natural death, something common in our work. The basics fit. History of cardiovascular diseases, no external signs of struggle, no visible injuries. The preliminary report showed nothing unexpected, but something inside me pushed me to look more closely. While conducting a meticulous inspection, repeating what already seemed like a routine process, I noticed a small spot on the door frame of the bedroom, almost a tiny bit of sweat mixed with dust. But when I examined it under a magnifying glass, I discovered a very faint fingerprint. No one else on the team had noticed or recorded it. That fingerprint was the only piece of evidence that did not seem to fit. It wasn't easy to clean or get a clear image of it, but with patience, we managed to recover it and compare it with the databases. What I discovered left me frozen. The fingerprint did not belong to the deceased or any close relatives. It wasn't from the doctors or experts who had been there before either. It was someone else, someone who should not have been there. This small mark completely changed the investigation. From that detail, we opened a new line of inquiry that led us to discover that the man's death was not as natural as it seemed. There was a hidden story behind it, an intricate web that only that fingerprint could expose. And all that thanks to the patience to observe what everyone else considered insignificant. In forensic science, every body, every detail, can tell stories that seem impossible. That is why I never underestimated what a tiny fingerprint can reveal. Now I will tell you how that fingerprint changed not only a case, but also my professional perspective. Ready to find out? Stay with me until the end, because this is something you won't see coming. IT was a finding that seemed ordinary, an elderly adult found without complications. Everything added up until I discovered a minimal fingerprint that no one had recorded. That small piece of evidence completely changed the investigation and taught me that every body, no matter how silent it seems, can tell stories no one imagines. Patience and attention to detail are key in forensic science. When I arrived at the scene, at first glance, everything indicated a natural death. A man around 75 years old, found in his living room, sitting in his favorite armchair, with apparent signs of having suffered a heart attack. The police and paramedics had detected nothing unusual, and the family, although visibly shaken by the loss, had expressed no suspicions. However, something in me, after so many years of practice, urged me to look beyond the obvious. I began by meticulously examining the body, as must always be done. I checked every detail, every external sign. The skin showed some age spots, but nothing that indicated violence or trauma. Internally, the preliminary examination confirmed what was expected. The heart showed alterations compatible with a chronic disease. But as I inspected the hands, searching for usual traces, my gaze stopped on the right arm, near the elbow. There was a small, almost imperceptible fingerprint, marked with dry blood, that seemed to have been completely overlooked. That print was not the deceased's. It did not have the typical pattern of an accidental mark. It was different, and its location was also strange. My intuition led me to request specialized analysis at the fingerprint laboratory. When the results arrived, they confirmed that the print belonged to someone else, someone who had been in contact with the body shortly before the death was recorded. But who? And above all, why had that print gone unnoticed? With that new clue, my mind began to form questions. to piece together a puzzle that had seemed closed until then. I started interviewing the family and neighbors again, searching for any detail that might relate to the presence of a third party at the scene. It was during one of those conversations, over lukewarm coffee, that the man's daughter mentioned something she had kept silent until then. The night before, her father had received a visit from a man no one knew. According to her, a neighbor had come with intentions of helping him with something having to do with papers and properties. No one else knew anything about that visit. That information made me understand why the print was right on the arm, almost as if this person had touched or held the elderly man, perhaps to help him or, who knows, for something worse. From that moment, everything took an unexpected turn. The case ceased to be a simple, natural passing away and became an intrigue hiding something more. I began reviewing other clues, fragmented conversations, and the man's life story, which was not as common as it was thought. In the deceased medical file, I found that in recent months he had granted his power of attorney to someone, but the records were confusing. I contacted public records offices and notaries to clarify to whom he had entrusted his assets and legal affairs. It was there that another surprise struck me. The name on those papers wasn't the daughter's, as the family had assumed, but a third party. Someone who did not appear in police investigations and who, according to records, had frequent meetings with the elderly man shortly before he died. With that clue, the case took a darker turn. I began thinking about the possibility of deception, abuse of trust, or manipulation, perhaps even a death induced to obtain economic benefit. I did not want to rush to conclusions without evidence, but that small blood-stained print had opened a door that no one believed was there. It was a call not to underestimate the invisible. While organizing all the evidence and preparing the definitive autopsy, I returned to the scene of the finding to look for something that might have been overlooked. I walked slowly through the same place where I had found the body. My gaze rested on the furniture, the floor, even the walls. That's when I noticed something else. Marks on the edge of the armchair, as if someone had leaned heavily to get up or to steady themselves. Those marks had completely disappeared in the initial accounts, but now seemed important. They could indicate a struggle or a silent scuffle. I returned to the laboratory with this new information and requested an analysis of the residues on the armchair. The results arrived quickly. Traces of a toxic substance, in small amounts but enough to affirm that the elderly man had been exposed to something harmful hours before his death. That also explained rigidity and certain atypical muscle responses detected in the preliminary autopsy. The combination of these elements, the fingerprint, the physical marks, the toxic substance, and the granting of power of attorney to a third party, painted a disturbing picture impossible to ignore. I knew I was facing a crime disguised as a natural death, and that revelation put me in direct contact with vulnerabilities society sometimes forgets. Those of the elderly, who are sometimes exposed and unprotected against ill-intentioned people. But there was still a need to understand who that mysterious visitor was and what motivations he had. In coordination with the judicial police, we launched a thorough search for profiles matching the print and the collected information. It was vital not to leave any loose ends. Meanwhile, I dedicated myself to thoroughly reviewing medical histories and recent patterns in other cases that might be related. I was convinced I was not facing an isolated case. Little by little, the pieces began to fit. We found that the unknown man had a history of manipulating and abusing elderly people in the neighborhood, and that he had moved near the scene weeks before. Moreover, another parallel police report indicated he had been reported in other cities for scams, but nothing had ever been proven against him until then. That criminal profile, along with the medical and forensic evidence, led me to connect the fingerprint with previous episodes, now seen in a new light thanks to the tiny detail no one else saw. Each day that passed made me wonder how many times justice had overlooked similar cases, how many bodies kept the truth silent for lack of someone who stopped to look calmly and deeply. The quick glance never reaches the essence. It is a persistent detail that becomes a thread to unravel the tangle. The investigation became a delicate balance between the search for truth and the protection of the victims' and families' integrity. Maintaining sensitivity at every step was a challenge that undoubtedly showed in every conversation, every report, every meticulous analysis. But that was the price I consciously accepted to pay to achieve what seemed impossible at the beginning, Justice. Finally, the definitive toxicological analysis confirmed the presence of a slow-acting poison, administered in calculated doses to simulate a natural heart collapse. The fingerprint I discovered was not just a mark, but the key that opened the door to this truth. It opened the door for us to pursue justice that had sought to escape under layers of prejudice and distracted eyes. At that moment, I felt not only the weight of my professional responsibility, but also a deep respect for that silent body, which, despite not being able to speak, had told its story through a forgotten print, a faint, almost insignificant trace. That print taught us that in forensics there is no small detail. Everything can be the difference between silence and truth. I will never forget how, amid that scene that seemed calm and enclosed, patience, observation, and persistence guided me to discover what was invisible to everyone else. That experience transformed me as a doctor and as a human being. It reaffirmed that every life, every story, is a universe worth listening to, and that forensic science is much more than seeking medical answers. It is about uncovering the humanity hidden in every case. What came next was an almost obsessive refinement of every clue, every whisper of truth hidden among shadows. I knew the fingerprint was not just another piece of data. It was a master key that could reveal the culprit's face and unravel the entire plot woven around that death, which seemed natural. The investigation began to turn into a game of chess, where every move had to be measured with precision, and every answer brought with it new questions. With the confirmation of the poison and the connection to the fingerprint, the police intensified the search for the suspect, a middle-aged man with vague records, whose print seemed to float among several names and false addresses. It was not the first time he had used fictitious identities to slip away from justice or to climb in his deceptions. Meanwhile, I kept digging into the old man's biography, trying to understand what motivated the stranger to approach so insistently, and what exactly was the nature of the documents the victim had entrusted to him. Thus, I discovered a nearly novelistic web: inheritance problems, hidden family disputes, broken friendships, and behind it all, the shadow of loneliness. The old man, despite having a close family, had begun to isolate himself more and more, and this vulnerability had opened a door to the opportunist. The neighbors whispered about recent arguments, but no one seemed willing to intervene, and when we touched on those ideas, the stories got lost again in contradictions and silences. That atmosphere of fear and distrust reminded me that, many times, justice must not only fight crime, but also abandonment. One day, while reviewing photos and documents collected at the scene, I noticed again a small but unsettling detail: a crumpled bank receipt in the deceased's pocket, dated just hours before his death. The amount was large, and the recipient corresponded to an account that at first seemed anonymous. That simple piece of information led me to request more details from the financial institution, and what I discovered deepened the plot even more. That account was directly linked to the suspect, clearly used to receive funds that could have been extracted through the old man's manipulation. This finding not only confirmed the hypothesis of economic interest, but also indicated premeditation. Someone had been carefully planning how to take advantage, how to profit, without raising suspicion. More and more, the death scene seemed like a board where pieces were moved to disguise a murder as an inevitable tragedy. And what was even more relevant, that person had intimate and frequent access to the sick man, implying a personal and painful betrayal. In parallel, a team of police cybersecurity experts began digging into the suspect's virtual movements. There, another fascinating thread emerged. His social media and various digital platform profiles showed a double life. Posts that seemed harmless hid connections with fraudulent entities, groups dedicated to scams and document forgery. He was a man who knew how to camouflage himself in the real and digital worlds, a capable manipulator who wove webs with patience and skill. As time went on, I frequently spoke with the old man's family, trying to separate truth from emotion and despair. The daughter, although hurt, began to cooperate more openly after understanding that the facts were much more complex than thought. She provided details she initially feared to share, afraid of causing more harm or distrust. Among these revelations, she confided that her father had received veiled threats after signing the papers, and that in his last week he had seemed uneasy, as if watching every shadow. Upon knowing this, I couldn't help but feel a lump in my throat. Longevity is not always synonymous with security. Sometimes it is a tale of vulnerability and fear hidden behind daily routine. One of the tensest moments came when the suspect was finally located. His capture was discreet, without much noise, but filled with palpable tension. During the interrogation, the fingerprint found on the deceased's arm was the key to the accusation. Faced with the evidence, he tried to deny any involvement, but the inconsistencies in his statements betrayed him. He admitted to visiting the old man, but claimed it was only to help with formalities, downplaying any direct contact. However, he could not explain the presence of the poison or the recent disappearance of several original documents. During his detention, I felt a mixture of relief and sadness. This story had left open wounds in many lives, and the path to justice was long and full of shadows. Deep down, I wondered how many other cases remained unsolved, how many body silence truths buried under apathy or negligence. The silence of that elderly man, translated into a tiny fingerprint and a toxic substance, had broken that routine, bringing the truth to light. That small print was much more than a mark. It was a cry of someone who did not want his story to be lost. As we began preparing the case for trial, the deepest lesson stayed with me. Meticulousness and patience are the most powerful weapons in forensic science. We cannot afford to overlook details no matter how small or irrelevant they may seem, because in them may lie the difference between a case falsely closed and true justice. I also understood that behind every corpse is a world of experiences, struggles, and secrets, and that we, as forensic experts, are the guardians who listen to those silenced voices. That nearly invisible fingerprint taught me to see with different eyes, to value the importance of empathy with bodies and the stories they bring. Beyond medicine or law, this profession is a constant exercise in humanity. And that day, I understood that the truth, although hidden behind layers of lies and appearances, always seeks a way to be revealed, sometimes in the most unexpected and simple form. Ultimately, that case reminded me that our work is not limited to examining bodies, but must be an unrelenting quest for justice for those who no longer have a voice. And that, although death seems final and silent, every body has a story to tell. You just have to know how to listen carefully, patiently, and respectfully. Because sometimes a tiny fingerprint guides us to the greatest truth. And that truth, though hidden, is always there, waiting to be discovered. But just when we thought the case was heading toward a clear conclusion, an unexpected twist emerged that took the investigation into an even darker and more complex territory. The forensic analysis began to reveal details that had gone unnoticed until then, as if the truth resisted coming to light easily. The poison was neither common nor easy to acquire, but a rare and strictly controlled substance, which meant access could only have been possible through someone with special permits or contacts in very specific places. This opened a new line of investigation that extended the search beyond the suspect's known circle, toward people in contexts that at first seemed unrelated but gradually began to fit into this puzzle. Simultaneously, as we continued digging into the timeline of the elderly man's last days, we found inconsistencies in the testimonies of people close to him who had until then been considered trustworthy, friends, neighbors, even some family members. It was as if the death had symbolized a breaking point that unleashed hidden resentments, silent fears, and betrayals disguised as silence. I had the persistent feeling that the fingerprint, that microscopic and initially unnoticed trace, was just the tip of the iceberg of a much deeper and more painful web, a web that connected personal interests, dark secrets, and a desperate desire to maintain an appearance that was already crumbling. Amid the scenario, a newly arrived testimony shook everything we thought we knew. An old caretaker of the elderly man, a woman who had worked for him many years ago, came forward with documents and accounts that, although at first seemed contradictory to the official version, marked a crucial point. She spoke of a person who had been manipulating the grandfather for some time, not only financially but also emotionally. She described how the victim had been subjected to subtle blackmail, a psychological game that increasingly isolated him until he reached a state of absolute vulnerability. That confession made it clear that the suspect had not acted just days before the death. The plot extended over a much longer period, invisible in the reports and initial statements. This led us to review all the accumulated material with renewed criteria, to rethink the timelines, and to evaluate each piece with extreme care. It was then that the forensic laboratory detected traces of another compound in the elderly man's body, a substance that had not appeared in initial tests because its concentration was minimal, almost imperceptible. The combined effect of the two poisons, one slow-acting and the other faster, suggested a meticulous plan to avoid an immediate outcome that would arouse suspicion. Confirming that this chemical combination had been administered with conscious intent completely changed the perspective on crime. It was no longer a disguised accident, but a deliberate act carefully calculated to appear natural. While investigating, a detail that seemed minor arose but became decisive. In the notebook where the elderly man used to record his medical appointments and important calls, I found notes reflecting a significant increase in strange phone calls and unexpected visits in the weeks before his death. The nature of those encounters, which at first seemed harmless, now revealed a clear pattern of control and pressure, and the fingerprint found was linked to some of those fateful moments. In those words, fingers marking dates and names, we discovered signs of a network that involved not only the man captured, but also other figures who had until then been shadows, elusive players. This made us see that we were facing a story of group manipulation, where several actors played different roles. As of the elderly man's death were just one stage in a much larger plan. The investigation became even more complicated when, in the suspect exchange of messages and emails, a hidden code appeared in apparently innocent files. It was not just trivial information or a common scam. It was an encrypted system, coded communication indicating an organized network dedicated to stealing not only material goods, but also identities and personal secrets, using fear and dependency to control their victims. Each piece of information that surfaced escalated in danger and sophistication. I understood that this man, far more than a common fraudster, acted as a kind of controller, a manipulator who had found his perfect prey in an isolated, vulnerable, and, sadly, trusting man. The tension in the atmosphere increased day by day. The family, once united in illness and care, began a fracture between those demanding quick justice and those doubting such a painful truth. Some relatives refused to believe that someone so close could be involved in such a terrible situation. Under these circumstances, I had to mediate more than once, trying to maintain calm and focus on the undeniable fact. The death had not been natural, and every detail, from the fingerprint to the bank transfers and the coded words, pointed to a cold and calculated web. The decisive moment came when the suspect was linked to another failed fraud attempt that had happened years earlier in a nearby city. This broadened the scope of the investigation and allowed the police access to records and testimonies that had not been available before. The archaic file that resurfaced contained names of accomplices, places, operational methods, and an obvious pattern, always using human vulnerability as a weapon to gain control and money. The way the suspect moved, with multiple identities and social facades, was nothing more than the visible manifestation of a much more structured and dangerous network that was beginning to be dismantled. As I read the reports and watched the interview videos, I felt the weight of the story we were uncovering. Every fact we added seemed to confirm that the small fingerprint found on the elderly man's arm was not just a mark of contact. It was a sign of a presence that wanted to be erased, an echo that resisted disappearing, and that, with patience and rigor, we managed to capture. I felt, once again, what we often mention in our team. In forensic science, truth is built from tiny details, persistence, and a deep respect for the dignity of the victims. But this case also taught me something harsher, less tangible, and sadder. How loneliness amplifies risks and how social indifference can be fertile ground for those who wield deception and cruelty. The elderly man not only died at the hands of a murderer, but also of a human system that failed to protect him when he needed it most, when words and looks should have been enough to shield him. The layers behind the crime were many, each with its own burden of pain and abandonment. When the case finally passed to the judge and the lawyers prepared for trial, my role as forensic expert became a living testimony of that difficult truth. In the courtroom, the evidence built from that tiny fingerprint, the hidden poison, and the digital data created an unrelenting narrative that dismantled the accused's lies. Seeing justice begin to break through confusion, guilt, and fear gave me bittersweet feelings. Satisfaction for shedding light on such dense darkness, but also sadness for human and social costs such stories entail. At the end of that last day in the courtroom, I walked the streets of Medellin with a mix of emotions. I thought about how many times society and justice need us, the forensic experts, to tell those stories others prefer not to see. I reflected on the power of small details, those unnoticed traces that hold the key to giving a voice back to those who can no longer speak. And I understood more than ever that our mission goes beyond the body. It is a commitment to memory, to truth, and to every human being who, in their silence, waits to be heard. Those reflections stayed with me like an indelible mark, as clear as that unnoticed fingerprint, a reminder that, in our profession, patience, observation, and above all, empathy, are the most valuable tools we have to transform fragments of mystery and pain into justice and hope. Deep down, that small fingerprint was much more than a clue. It was a call, a subtle cry that invited us not to give up, to stand firm against the darkness, and to believe that, although the truth seems hidden or denied, it can always be discovered and honored. And as I contemplate that story, I keep thinking of all those voices sleeping beneath silence. Because as I learned in this case, listening with attention, respect, paying heed to the details others overlook, can forever change the course of a life or many. Every trace has its story, and every story, its justice. You just need to have open eyes and heart to find them. What began as an apparently simple case, when an elderly man found his home without obvious signs of violence, turned into a much more complex plot, where every new detail pushed us toward hidden layers of pain and manipulation. The minimal trace I had initially discovered was only the spark that ignited an investigation that seemed endless. With each analysis, each interrogation, and every line of code deciphered, the image of the old man, vulnerable and isolated, emerged more clearly, revealing a face most had not wanted to see. There were moments when I felt the truth slipping through our fingers. Contradictions in testimonies were small cracks that at first seemed insignificant, but over time became irrefutable evidence of a web of deceit. In that search, we learned that the silence of those around the elderly man was not simply the absence of words, but complicit in what we sought to uncover, as if fear of consequences or shame had paralyzed those who, despite everything, knew fragments of story. One of the most striking things was discovering how the suspect, far from being an impulsive criminal or opportunist, had planned every step meticulously. Not only did he study the old man's lifestyle, but he had woven a web of control that included emotional blackmail, economic manipulations, and a digital network almost invisible to the naked eye. Finding that hidden combination of poisons was, for me, a revelation of the perversity with which this crime had been designed. The mixture was not a random act, but a mechanism intended to disguise, to make the death appear natural, and also to hide the truth from those who should have protected him the most. As the team reviewed phone calls and visit logs, we realized that this network extended with an almost terrifying subtlety. People who seemed like mere acquaintances or neighbors revealed themselves as key players in a scenario of power and control. This made me reflect deeply on how, often, victims are not only facing a visible aggressor, but are trapped in invisible systems made of fear, manipulation, and coercion that leave them alone in their darkest moments. In this case, that loneliness was a shadow that accompanied the old man until his last days. The testimony of the former caregiver was a turning point. The woman not only provided relevant documents and accounts, but confronted us with the humanity behind this tragedy through her presence. She spoke of a man who had changed, who became submissive and distrustful, who had lost the essence remembered by those who knew him. Her story was a call to look beyond the surface and understand that behind every forensic case, there's a life story that deserves to be heard. It was also a reminder that justice must not only punish, but also understand and preserve the memory of those who are no longer here. Hearing that story led me to revisit the most intangible and human aspect of the investigation: emotional fragility and vulnerability in the face of those who seek to take advantage of others. I understood that the killer had not only attacked a body, but had shattered a relationship of trust, a reason to live, a safe refuge that the old man had lost. That realization gave the entire process a different weight, more urgent, more tangible. Forensics was no longer just about evidence and techniques, but about restoring dignity to someone who was stripped of it in life and then in death. The discovery of the second, almost imperceptible toxic substance was another unexpected blow. Its presence in the old man's body was a silent signature of the level of planning and coldness behind the crime. This was not a crime of passion or an improvised act, but a calculated one meant to remain hidden. That chemical combination, with its double tempo effect, made me think of how many times in my career I had seen deaths whose details escaped immediate view, and how often those subtleties could change the course of a trial, a verdict, a life. It was a valuable lesson that reinforced the importance of always looking beyond the obvious. When examining the notebook where the elderly man recorded appointments and calls, I felt I held not just a diary of activities, but one of growing desperation. The notes showed dates when pressure increased, when a victim seemed trapped in an invisible web of schedules, meetings, and messages unnoticed by his loved ones. That was when the tiny, easily overlooked fingerprint gained even greater relevance. It represented not only physical contact, but a connection point in that time where every meeting, every call, added to the weight of the story of control and domination. As we progressed in the digital investigation, discovering the encrypted code in the suspect's files was like opening Pandora's box. He was not simply an isolated criminal. We were facing a person who, through a complex system, managed a network of systematic manipulation of identities, secrets, and assets. It was as if this digital network was a modern extension of the control and coercion he exerted in real life. That duality between the tangible and the virtual gave the case a much more disturbing, deeper dimension. I realized that behind the lights and shadows of the city operated mechanisms capable of destroying lives without drawing attention. The atmosphere grew increasingly tense as the family began to fracture under pressure of the truth. I felt in those discussions the difficulty humans have in facing the closest betrayals, in accepting that those we love can be involved in unimaginable tragedies. It was a painful process, where I had to remind myself repeatedly that although justice is necessary, it also demands patience and humanity. Presenting evidence was not enough to heal. There were deep wounds that not even the law could touch directly. One of the key pieces to move forward decisively was a link we established between the suspect and a failed fraud attempt years earlier in a nearby city. This connection not only strengthened the accusation, but allowed authorities to detect patterns and methods that repeated themselves, revealing a long-standing modus operandi. It was as if we were dismantling a mechanism that had operated in the shadows for years, always taking advantage of the solitude and fragility of its victims. That revelation not only expanded the investigation, but also gave us more tools to protect future vulnerable people. While reviewing testimonies, recordings, and documents, I felt a mix of exhaustion and determination. The elderly man's story and his torment echoed repeatedly in my mind, like a reverberation I could not silence. In those moments, I understood how fundamental forensic work is not only to establish facts, but to rescue the dignity and memory of those who can no longer do so for themselves. The trace we identified, that slight mark on the skin, took on symbolic value beyond the technical. It was a voice of man who fought until the end to be heard. The deepest lesson this case left me was understanding the precariousness in which many elderly people live, especially when isolated and under the guardianship or care of others. This combination of physical, emotional, and social fragility is a constant risk, and this case highlighted the urgency of creating genuine and effective support networks. For me, it was not just a matter of criminal justice. It was a call to collective responsibility toward those who, in their vulnerability, deserve protection, respect, and companionship. At the conclusion of the investigation, and in sharing the results of the court hearing, I felt the weight and, at the same time, the importance of our work. The narrative we built from minuscule details now had the potential to deliver justice, even if only partially, because no sentence can restore what was lost. While the defendant sought to defend himself, the evidence woven by forensic science revealed an indisputable pattern. The crime was a product of a chain of abuses and deceptions meticulously crafted. At the end of that last day in court, as I walked the streets of Medellin, I thought about how so many of the cases I handle represent the outcome of lonely, silenced, and forgotten lives. They seem like faded echoes, but for us, they are living stories waiting to be told. This experience reaffirmed to me the commitment we have as forensic experts to go beyond the surface, to remain patient, to persevere in the search for truth, and always to place empathy as our guide. I discovered that even the smallest trace can contain the map needed to navigate a complex and dark human tragedy. That idea stayed with me, that justice begins with the details others overlook, and that in many cases, those details must be heard with an open heart, not just to condemn or free, but to honor the lives that have passed, in their full humanity, with all their light and shadows. In this case, that silent trace allowed us to find the truth and take a step toward justice, even though the path was hard and full of obstacles. And as I keep looking back toward the lab hallways, the images of the trial, and those silences that made the difference, I know my work as a forensic expert does not end with the conclusion of a case. Every body is a testament, every small clue a story, and every investigation an opportunity to change more than just judicial outcomes. Because in every unsuspected trace, in every detail others would ignore, may lie the voice we were waiting to hear, the secret that resisted, and the justice that deserves to forge a path through the darkness. As we delve deeper into each element of the investigation, the network that initially seemed tenuous began to reveal itself as a much more intricate and dark web. The pieces fit together in a puzzle that exposed not only the old man's death, but also an entire system of exploitation to which, unfortunately, many elderly people are exposed without society noticing in time. It was as if we had touched an open wound that, although silent, had been bleeding for years. What surprised me most was the calm with which the suspect pulled his strings. There was no hurry or desperation. His actions were methodical, almost predictable. Every time we reviewed data or listened to testimonies, that facade of tranquility prevailed, as if he wanted to tell us that he had complete control of the situation. But there was no control when faced with the reality we were beginning to unravel. The mood in our team fluctuated between frustration and hope because, although the terrain was complicated, the accumulation of visible and invisible details encouraged us to keep going. Finding the second toxic substance involved a thorough review of samples that had been in our laboratories weeks earlier. The first time I analyzed the liquid in the blood, the reaction was almost instinctive. It was something common, perhaps a misadministered medication or an environmental contaminant. But that second compound, so discreet, almost ridiculous in its concentration, was a message. That message that only someone extremely careful and with advanced knowledge could design. It told us not to be mistaken, that it was a conscious and planned act, an attempted murder with the firm intention of going unnoticed. The physics of poisons and their effects on the body was something I knew well. However, I never thought I would learn so much about the mind behind them. The mixture found in the old man's body, the timing of its effects, the symptoms that might have appeared unnoticed at the time, all were part of a mechanism to confuse and cloud suspicion. It was a kind of slow-motion murder where each dose and interval functioned like gears in a macabre clock. I then remembered previous cases where deaths categorized as natural also hid these strategies. The line between life and death was, in many ways, a maneuver of shadows and silences. The notebook with the old man's personal notes became an emotional and physical map. It was not just a routine record. It was tangible evidence of a person who, until his last day, tried to organize his life amid the chaos consuming him. Every underlined date, every mentioned name, every recorded hour spoke of a man who resisted, who tried to cling to something, even if it was a hope of a meeting or a call that never came. That small notebook was a mute cry, a living testimony that urged us to continue, not to assume that the truth eroded like dust on its pages. Returning to the analysis of digital connections opened a disturbing dimension. The encrypted code, which at first seemed only a clumsy attempt to hide files, began to clarify patterns of communication, financial transfers, and hidden messages. Technology, which we as a society use to connect, inform, and protect ourselves, in this case was an instrument of manipulation and silence. That duality made us feel as if we faced an enemy not only physical but also intangible, almost unattainable, a system control extending beyond direct interaction, penetrating spaces that seemed private and safe. The situation became more complicated when the family, confronted with the evidence, split into factions. It was not just an emotional crack. It was an abyss that showed us how pain tests the most intimate fibers of people. Some defended the suspect with arguments full of denial. Others cried in despair for what they had ignored. And some simply disappeared under the pressure of facing such a harsh reality. Amid it all, I felt the weight of the responsibility we bore, aware that every word spoken during the trial not only affected the legal fate of the accused, but also the emotional health of those left behind. In those moments, the forensic work also becomes a human endeavor, an effort to balance justice and compassion. Thanks to the longitudinal investigation we undertook to detect patterns, the link to a previous fraud attempt in another city was confirmed. By looking at maps, databases, and prior accusations, we saw how this individual operated with alarming impunity, taking advantage of the loneliness of vulnerable people to execute his plans. That discovery pushed us to collaborate with other authorities, share information, and establish protocols to help prevent similar new cases. I realized then that our work did not end with closing a file, but was the beginning of a path toward protection and prevention, with the certainty that many elderly people struggle harshly against adversities far beyond the physical body. The nights in the laboratory became endless. I reviewed reports, charts, and recordings, searching for any new clue or pattern, until exhaustion made me question if we would ever unravel that tangle. But despite the fatigue, a certain inner fire kept me standing. Within me was a certainty that the story deserved to be told, that the truth about that man had to come to light, that our work was a fundamental part of a larger process. To humanize the judicial process, to give face and name to a body that could no longer speak for itself. That minimal trace I discovered at the beginning took on a value beyond what I expected. It became a symbol of resistance, of the importance of meticulous attention. It was a sign that broke the silence and put on the table the memory of someone who, until the end, fought to be heard. In those small, seemingly insignificant details lies the dignity of our victims. And as a forensic expert, I understood that my job is to protect that dignity, to represent those voices, and never to underestimate the power of a watchful and patient gaze. What I learned from this case about the reality of elderly people in our society left me with a deep unease. The precariousness of their conditions, their isolation, the fragility that often makes them invisible to those who should care for them, is an issue demanding urgent attention. This man, in his vulnerability, was victim not only of a criminal act, but a collective failure of a system that still has not found a way to truly protect those who need it most. That thought accompanied me as I finished in court and beyond, as I sat at my desk, facing a world that seemed to remain indifferent. When delivering the final report and hearing the verdict, I experienced a mix of emotions: relief at having found justice, sadness for what could never be completely repaired, and renewed determination to move forward. I saw in the faces of the tribunal members and, above all, in the family, that behind every legal word was a life marked by absence and grief. I understood that my voice, and that of all who work in this field, is an extension of those memories, a necessary breath so that oblivion does not claim its place too quickly. As I returned home after the trial, Medellin showed its usual bustle, but for me nothing was the same. I knew that night, while the city slept, many people continued to be silent victims, trapped in difficult circumstances unseen by anyone. Cases like this remind me that we have the responsibility not only to do justice, but to transform the way we look at and care for those who depend on us. My work is much more than analysis and tests. It is a commitment to the life behind death. That last day in court also brought me a thought that has become a personal mantra. That forensic work is a bridge between silence and truth, an opportunity to give voice to those who have been silenced, a form of justice that does not always translate into convictions, but does into recognition and memory. The trace that no one saw at first was the key to opening that bridge, making the invisible visible, and reminding us that in every detail an entire story can reside, waiting to be discovered. This case left me with a lesson I carry with me every time I enter the laboratory or arrive at a scene. Never underestimate the power of the small, because it can be the difference between understanding or overlooking a vital truth. Patience, observation, empathy, those are the tools that, beyond technique, bring us closer to the human beings behind each body. No matter how insignificant a mark, a sigh, or a silence may seem, it always deserves to be explored. I also discovered that the true impact of our work is not measured simply in sentences or rulings, but in the lasting effect it has on the dignity of the person and collective conscience. Sometimes I wonder how many other cases like this remain hidden within the silent walls of a house or in the daily routine no one questions. But it also comforts me to know there is a team behind, watching, not giving up, and willing to search for the last trace. Because, in the end, justice begins with deep attention to what others overlook, with the will to listen to silent voices, and with a firm vision that every life matters, even when it seems forgotten. That certain has accompanied me ever since, and surely Always will as we progress in the analysis of the notebook and digital connections. The investigation took on a dimension I had never imagined. It was not just about deciphering an isolated crime. We were unearthing a web in which human vulnerability was common currency and abuse a systematic practice. There was something unsettling in knowing that behind the numbers and formulas I reviewed daily in the lab, there were lives marked by indifference and cruelty. That trace, which at first seemed irrelevant, now took on unusual weight. It was the first link of a chain we had been trying to break for weeks. The following days and nights passed at an almost obsessive pace. I remember watching the computer screen, eyes tired, and mind trying to connect every point appearing on the digital map. The way the suspect used various identities in different cities, his ability to evade justice for years, seemed too big a lie to be true. There was something Machiavellian in his modus operandi, in that apparent preparation for every scenario, in the way he manipulated his victims with a palpable coldness that shivered through me inside the forensic suit, which only protected me physically, but not from that moral shadow. One night, while reviewing security camera footage near the place where the old man was found, I noticed a detail I hadn't seen before. It was a shadow that didn't quite fit the scene, a movement too quick to be casual. I paused, holding my breath, and zoomed in. It was a suspect, smelling almost like a hunter returning to his prey. But the most disturbing thing was what he held in his hands. Several pills, apparently innocent, but which I now understood had a much more sinister purpose. That moment changed everything. I realized we were facing a criminal who had learned to play hide-and-seek with death itself, using small, almost imperceptible doses to control another human being's life without anyone noticing. The next phase was interviewing those who had been close to the elderly man in his final days, a task that became an emotional challenge. Finding family members willing to talk was difficult. Many were still in denial or blocked reality out of fear or guilt. Others showed a mix of resentment and pain that made clear that beyond the criminal act, abandonment had been the true tragedy. In one of those interviews, a neighbor with a trembling voice told me how she had heard faint screams during the early morning, sounds she initially thought were caused by age or illness. But now, with the knowledge gained, I understood those complaints were signs of a body begging for help and a mind fighting against the invisible poison that was slowly advancing. That confession plunged me into an inconsolable sadness. Despite the fatigue and the shadow of discouragement, the team maintained the dedication characteristic of those who work in the forensic field. Every night was a battle against exhaustion, but also a small victory in the pursuit of justice. I could say it was in those dark moments that the investigation took an unexpected leap. An analyst found a pattern in the suspect's financial information, something previously unconsidered. There were small transfers spread over long periods, as if trying to avoid alarms or controls. Small signals that seemed innocuous but created a network extending toward other potential victims, people likely still trapped in the voracious system we had uncovered. What followed was a combination of swift and precise actions. We coordinated with the police and other judicial entities to conduct raids in places linked to those transfers, and what we found confirmed our suspicions. False documents, multiple identities, fraudulent contracts signed in the names of elderly people who couldn't defend themselves. That evidence not only strengthened the case but exposed a structured network of trafficking and abuse of people who should have been protected, not exploited. The feeling was bittersweet. On one hand, hope, because we were tearing down a criminal network. On the other, sorrow, because we had arrived too late for several victims whose voices were silenced forever. The judicial process was an additional challenge. The defense tried to discredit every finding, casting doubt on the science behind the analysis and suggesting that the deaths could have been caused by natural causes or accidents. Faced with those attacks, my role was to present a truth founded not only on evidence, but on the conviction that behind every number was a human being with a story deserving justice. The tension in the courtroom was palpable. Every argument, every testimony seemed to mark the rhythm of a pulse fluctuating between certainty and doubt. But the true strength lay in the accumulation of details, in the patient work of putting together small pieces to reveal a clear and irrefutable picture. In moment of pause, when the court rested and the team tried to reconnect with their humanity beyond the bench, we shared stories, reflections, and the weight we carried. I was surprised to find in my colleagues the same fire that kept me standing, that mixture of sensitivity and determination only those in this field know. Because we know that data alone is not enough. We must put heart into it. Understand that every case is connected to broken dreams, to families that will never be whole again, and that we are, in a way, guardians of their memory and dignity. Meanwhile, the investigation continued relentlessly. New clues appear in unexpected places. Encrypted messages on messaging platforms that seem harmless, social media contacts pointing to other involved actors, documents suggesting a broader knowledge of the corrupt system. This led us into complex terrain where the line between digital and human blurred. It was clear the suspect operated not only physically but also in a virtual network that made tracking his movements difficult. And yet, thanks to a combination of intuition, technology, and experience, we began to corner him. The most disturbing thing, however, was discovering that this case was not an exception, but a reflection of reality, repeating silently in many streets and homes. Elderly people, isolated for various reasons, dependent, with less strength to defend themselves, become easy targets for expert and patient predators. It forced me to rethink the role of our system, not only as a punitive instrument, but as a preventive barrier. Justice, in its purest form, must go beyond condemning crimes. It must be a tool to protect and dignify lives, especially those whom time and society have left in the shadows. During one of those long days, I received an unexpected call. An anonymous witness wanted to provide information that could be crucial. It was an employee who had worked for the suspect and who, after years, decided to break the silence. His accounts painted an even broader picture of exploitation, with sharp details about how documents were manipulated, how victims were pressured into signing what they didn't understand, and how some local authorities may have been complicit, perhaps unknowingly, but facilitating with indifference the advancement of the criminal scheme. That call was a decisive turning point that gave us the strength to keep digging, to cross those lines that sometimes seemed too threatening. As we processed all this information, an idea struck me forcefully. How many other cases, with traces as small as the one we discovered here, remain hidden? That question wouldn't let go of me, and I believe it never will. In the fight for justice, patience and persistence are more than virtues. They are a call to remain alert, not to let worldly noise drown out those details that seem minimal, but are actually the key to saving lives or dismantling networks of abuse. It is in that almost imperceptible space where truth takes root and gains meaning. Then I remember that old man, whose last days were marked by a terrifying silence, but who managed to leave that small trace, a subtle sign of his reality and suffering. For him, and for those like him in such circumstances, our work had to be more than technical. It had to be an ethical and human commitment. Forensic science, understood this way, ceases to be just a profession and becomes a calling that embraces dignity, memory, and social justice. What seemed like a simple autopsy turned into a story of resistance and deep learning about the human soul, its shadows, and its struggles. In the end, it was not the ink or graphics, nor even the analyses that defined the fate of the case, but the sum of every tiny detail turned into evidence, every recovered voice, and every firm step taken with conviction. The trace no one noticed at the beginning ended up being more than the key to a crime. It was a symbol that no matter how small an act is, no matter how insignificant a sign may seem, it can be the difference between truth and oblivion. This experience taught me that true power lies in attentive observation, persistent patience, and profound respect for those who can no longer speak for themselves. Now, when I think back to that moment when it all began, I see clearly that each of us can be that trace for someone else. The call is not to pass by, but to be silent yet firm guardians of justice, to understand that every life matters and that dignity is not lost with death, but must be honored and protected long after the body goes dark. That is the greatest lesson I carry with me, one that accompanies me every time I return to the lab, ready to face another story that demands attention, patience, and a compassionate gaze, because in the work of serving the truth, there is no place for indifference or for details that seem invisible. That call was in some way like a breath of fresh air amidst a dense and gloomy atmosphere. The witness, speaking in a low and nervous voice, began to recount details that until then had gone unnoticed by us. He revealed, with chilling precision, the internal mechanisms the suspect used to manipulate not only his victims, but also those who were supposedly meant to protect them. I was struck by the coldness with which he described these actions, as if he were talking about a well-oiled gear that ran smoothly thanks to indifference and fear. However, behind that technical account, I could perceive the emotional burden, the weight of years carrying a guilt that could only now begin to be relieved by giving testimony. Every word I heard drew me deeper into a reality that was as concrete as it was painful. We learned that the suspect did not act alone. The network was broader than we had imagined, with collaborators and accomplices who, willingly or conveniently, allowed the system to function in favor of abuse. This information made us rethink our strategy. Stopping one person would not be enough. The investigation had to go all the way to dismantle that structure. I realized that we were facing more than a clinical case, a file, or a victim. We were confronting a social problem that transcended the individual and exposed the cracks in our system. Walking through that dark web, I felt that the very trace I had found on the old man's body became a symbol of resistance and hope. It was not just a physical mark, but an invisible sign of those who have suffered in silence, a signal that, though small, is capable of opening doors and generating change. That understanding forced me to look at forensic work from a broader perspective. It was not only about techniques or protocols, but about understanding that our job never ends when the body stops speaking, because behind each case there is a human network demanding justice, dignity, and a memory to honor. During those days, fatigue was a constant companion. I remember how the laboratory light stayed on well into the early morning hours, illuminating exhausted but determined faces. The feeling of being on the threshold of a major discovery was palpable, and although uncertainty stalked us, it also pushed us forward. There were moments when the pressure seemed unbearable, when the number of details to organize and scattered clues made us doubt whether we could assemble the puzzle. But the idea of leaving those victims forgotten was heavier than any fatigue, and that kept us steadfast. One day, while reviewing the final reports once again and cross-checking data with my team, something emerged that no one had noticed before. It was a pattern based on dates and places linked to the victims, but with enormous, almost mathematical precision. I was surprised by the suspect's awareness of the environment, how he chose moments of vulnerability to act, leaving behind small signs in the daily routines of his targets. That explained the difficulty we had had in finding a clear pattern until that moment. I then understood that every decision, every move, had been carefully calculated to hide the obvious and at the same time keep the chain of abuse running. This led us to completely change the way we approached the investigation, and, even more so, the work in the laboratory. It became necessary to carry out more specific and in-depth analyses in each case, with an almost obsessive focus on the small details. A forensic laboratory might seem like a cold and technical place, but in situations like this, it transforms into a kind of sanctuary where science, ethics, and hope converge. For me, every sample, every fragment was a valuable piece, a message that had to be listened to carefully. I could spend hours observing, adjusting microscopes, or reinterpreting results, searching for that detail that seemed insignificant but ultimately became the key to the mystery. New twists soon appeared. In one of the tests, we detected chemical traces in the tissues indicating the presence of medications that did not correspond to the old man's treatment, nor to anything prescribed by doctors. That revelation changed our perception. The poisoning was not accidental nor the result of natural deterioration. It was part of a systematic method to control and weaken the victim. Although we are talking about minimal doses, they were enough to alter a human being's health until rendering them dependent and, eventually, leading to death. That perverse machinery of administering the invisible poison with patience and premeditated intent impressed U.S. with its calculated brutality. Meanwhile, the judicial pressure increased. The suspect lawyers meticulously followed each report, trying to discredit evidence, questioning every testimony, and challenging the impartiality of science. At those moments, I had to learn to remain calm and fully trust the evidence and rigor of our work. Forensic science, when applied with honesty and detail, becomes a powerful shield against lies and corruption. But I also knew that it was not enough to present figures or results. I had to tell the story that each body and every indicator wanted to reveal. I had to translate the technical into the human, to make the court understand that we were not talking about theories, but about lives destroyed in cold blood. There were moments, however, when the weight of sadness was unbearable. During a visit to a care center for the elderly, where some victims might have stayed before their death, I saw the emptiness in the eyes of those who survived similar stories in their own flesh of abandonment and abuse. That experience reminded me that although justice might take time, our duty was to use every finding to prevent more people from falling into that web of exploitation. That reality, so close and everyday, impacted me more than any technical data and forced me to reaffirm that science and empathy cannot be separated. Every third day, we enter the autopsy room with a complex mixture of emotions: curiosity, respect, but also deep sadness. Death is not just a biological event. It is a story of lives that have ended, often in unjust and cruel ways. I knew that my work was the bridge between those silences and the truth, a truth that should not only be in the reports but also in the courts, in public opinion, in the hearts of those who seek a less hostile world. That tiny trace I had identified at the beginning transformed in every body, examined into a powerful testimony, a voice that resisted beyond death. Amid that whirlwind, there was also room for unexpected moments of humanity. On one occasion, one of my colleagues, visibly affected by the intensity of the case, shared with me a personal story that revealed how deeply these cases affect us. We talked for hours about the nature of our work, how sometimes it seems we carry an enormous weight, yet precisely that weight gives us meaning and connects us to the reason we chose this profession. It is in those often informal and spontaneous conversations where the team grows stronger and the intention to move forward against any adversity is reborn. One of the discoveries that impacted us most arose during an analysis of digital communications. There was a hidden pattern in the messages that seemed banal, used to coordinate actions or anonymize the illegal network. Deciphering those codes was like peering into a parallel dimension of the investigation, a world where technology and psychological manipulation intertwined to maintain control over the victims. That duality, between the tangible and the virtual, made us rethink not only our work, but also how crime evolves and constantly challenges those of us who seek justice. As the judicial process progressed, it became clear that the sum of evidence and testimonies created an irrefutable picture. Justice itself seemed to awaken before the evidence and arguments we presented, strengthened by science and the stories we recovered. However, we also saw resistance from internal networks, still trying to protect the suspect or at least minimize his responsibility. It was a painful reminder that the fight against abuse and corruption is not won only in laboratories or courtrooms, but also in collective awareness and will. Our mission did not end with a verdict, but had to extend to transform the social reality that allows these tragedies to occur. It was at that intersection of physical, where emotional burden and moral reward, that I understood a profound truth. Forensic science is not a mere technical tool, but an intimate and necessary act of justice. Every step we took, every detail that was not overlooked, was a way of giving voice back to those the system wanted to silence. That initial trace, small and almost invisible, was the spark that ignited a chain of events that changed lives and opened paths for those who will come after. In the end, what matters is not just a legal outcome, but the restored dignity and renewed commitment of those of us who work to protect it. Now, looking back and thinking of that old man and everything his body and that tiny trace revealed to us, I feel a mix of helplessness and gratitude. Helplessness for not having been able to prevent his suffering, but gratitude because his silence was transformed into a powerful song that today echoes in justice and public awareness. That duality is the essence of our work, recognizing human fragility while at the same time finding in it the strength to face the darkness. That is a lesson I carry with me and will continue to share, case by case, trace by trace, with the hope that we never stop looking with attention, patience, and compassion, because in the smallest details the greatest truth can be hidden. The investigation seemed to be progressing, but each step forward unearthed new layers of complexity that tested our patience and analytical ability. It was not simply a matter of evidence or testimonies, but of understanding a network that, like an invisible web, had trapped more people than we could imagine. At those moments, it felt like being in a shadow game where the truth tried to slip through the cracks of lies and omissions. Each finding forced us to review everything prior, to rethink theories, and uncover new questions from answers that seemed definitive. I clearly remember the day we finally managed to directly link the suspect to one of the places where abuses had been committed. It was not spectacular evidence, nor a great revealing testimony, but a small and seemingly trivial detail. A drop of a chemical compound we found on the victim's clothing that, thanks to thorough analysis, we could relate to products used exclusively at that site. That finding, initially unnoticed by everyone, became fundamental for assembling part of the puzzle. At that moment, we understood that we were not dealing with isolated incidents, but with a modus operandi that had been refined over time to evade detection. But the tension was mounting. To everyone's surprise, the clues we were finding began to hit an almost insurmountable wall. The internal resistance of the system that should guarantee justice. It was brutal to realize that many within the institutions not only did not want to cooperate, but actively tried to hinder the progress of the investigation. Some evidence mysteriously disappeared, other testimonies retracted without explanation, and amid that confusion, the pressure on our team increased. It was not easy to maintain clarity and focus with so many distractions and implicit threats. The feeling of treading on minefield was constant. Despite this, we could not remain paralyzed, so we strengthened our strategy. We prioritized rigorous documentation and the chain of custody and established continuous direct communication with the prosecution and human rights defenders to ensure no loose ends were left. There were days when frustration hit me closely, questioning whether all the effort would really achieve anything more than a mere file on a shelf. But the victim's gaze, the memory of that old man, and the certainty that behind every case there was a human being deserving justice compelled me to persist. As we advanced, the investigation took an unexpected turn when we discovered that the network was not only limited to people close to the elderly man or those who managed the care centers. There was an unsuspected connection with external actors, influential people with interests in maintaining a certain status quo. We detected monetary transfers that, under the guise of legality, were used to cover up bribes and by willpower. That finding was like opening a door to an even darker and more complex universe, where corruption and abuse walked hand in hand. The criminal dimension of this surpassed all expectations and transformed this case into a much deeper struggle. The weight of that reality on my team was palpable. The emotional toll increased day by day. Each member felt the impact of facing the harshness of systematic abuse and the indifference of those who should protect the victims. In some meetings, silence was stronger than any word because we knew we were seeing the hard face of society that still has not learned to care for its elders. It was in those moments that I understood that our work, although technical, was also deeply human. We could not allow bureaucracy or routine to anesthetize our sensitivity. The hours in the laboratory grew endless, but also more meaningful. During one especially long night, my eyes almost watering from exhaustion, I noticed an anomaly in one of the samples that had originally gone unnoticed. It involved biological residues mixed with particles that did not correspond to the age or natural conditions of the body. That small deviation indicated direct contact with toxic materials used to control the victims. It was not a coincidence. It was a carefully designed strategy to weaken the defenses without arousing obvious suspicion. That revelation added a new layer to our understanding, showing an even more sinister premeditation. As we gathered these details, the narrative of the case became more tragic, but also clearer. We knew we were facing a chain of systematically exploited vulnerabilities. Elderly people, many with few support networks, marginalized by society, who had become easy targets for a well-oiled criminal machine. The old man's body, with its minimal but persistent trace, had become the window that allowed us to see the magnitude of that invisible suffering. It was a silent testimony of thousands of similar stories that, without that trace, would have remained buried in oblivion. It was precisely at that point that collaborative work took on a crucial dimension. We needed the support of experts in various fields: psychologists, social workers, lawyers specialized in the rights of the elderly, and even hackers who helped us delve deeper into clandestine digital communications. Technology and human sensitivity had to go hand in hand to dismantle the network. Each one contributed a piece, and slowly, the picture began to emerge with a little more clarity. I learned that sometimes a multidisciplinary team becomes the best tool to face an enemy that not only operates in the shadows, but uses multiple faces to deceive. Tension in the courtroom reached its peak when we presented a comprehensive report contrasting all forensic findings with testimonial evidence and behavioral patterns we had identified. It was a decisive moment where science and truth clashed against the defense attorney strategy, ready to dismantle every argument with legal resources and technicalities. It was a test of endurance for all of us, not only because of what was at stake, but also due to exposure to a legal battle where not only reason was required, but also the ability to communicate it with strength and conviction. During the hearings, I had to learn to control my voice, not to let the emotional weight overflow, to explain clearly and precisely what was evident to us but might seem abstract or distant to many. I told the story of the old man, the importance of that tiny trace, and how each body was a silent but firm message. I tried to convey that behind every piece of data was a human being, a face, a life that deserved respect and protection. That connection with the audience, with judges and prosecutors, was essential so the evidence would not remain mere numbers but a call for justice. Throughout the process, I could not help but wonder how many similar cases remained anonymous, how many small and apparently insignificant traces were lost in daily routine. That reflection was a silent engine driving me forward. I knew our work had to reach beyond the file, beyond the sentence, and that the true victory would be transforming that pain into collective awareness. In that sense, my commitment grew stronger. I did not only want to solve that case, but to change the way vulnerable people are tended to and protected. In the end, when the sentence arrived, it brought with it a mixture of relief and bitterness. A conviction was achieved, a first step towards reparation, but the struggle was far from over. We knew the network had ramifications yet to be discovered, and that structural change would require time, political will, and much broader social commitment. However, at that moment, I felt we had lit a light in a dark place, that the invisible trace found on that body was now a symbol of resistance and hope for many. Since then, every time I enter my laboratory or visit care centers for the elderly, I carry that story with me, that trace that teaches me never to underestimate details. I know forensic science is passion and rigor, but it is also empathy and humanity. It invites us to listen to bodies that cannot speak and to transform silence into justice and dignity. That lesson was the most valuable gift from this case, a lesson that accompanies me and that I share with those who believe that truth is not always visible at first glance, but never gives up when sought with attention and respect. Today, more than ever, I want those who hear the story to understand that our work not only solves cases, but can save lives. That in every trace, no matter how small, may lie the key to dismantling an injustice. That patience, dedication, and honesty are powerful weapons against darkness. And above all, that behind every body is a soul that deserves to be heard, protected, and remembered. Because justice is not only an ideal, but a collective responsibility born in attention to the smallest details and extending towards building a fairer world. The trace I found that first time, that small sign no one had noticed, taught me that hidden truths are there waiting to be discovered, that silence can be broken, and that, although it may seem an endless battle at the intersection of science and humanity, there is always a path to hope. Thus, with each case, with each story, with each testimony, I keep learning that our work is much more than a job. It is an act of love for justice that can change lives, transform hearts, and leave an indelible mark on those of us who believe there is no darkness that cannot be illuminated by truth as we enter the final stages of the investigation. We increasingly felt that we were facing something much bigger than a single case. The pieces of the puzzle multiplied, but so did the threats, the obstacles, and the inertia of a system that seemed designed to protect those who, in reality, should have been exposed. The trace I had found the first time, that tiny mark that many overlooked, had become a guiding light, a starting point to unravel a much more tangled web than we ever imagined. However, not everything was written, and what seemed like an open window to the truth was about to reveal an unexpected twist. In a detailed review of reports and records, a new piece of information caught my attention. A discrepancy in the timeline that, although subtle, did not fit with anything we had seen until then. It was an unrecorded period, a lapse during which there was no supervision or official records at the center where the abuses were committed. We then decided to conduct a deeper, almost obsessive review with the help of cutting-edge technology and digital analysis experts. For weeks, we traced cameras, conversations, and movements searching for that blank space in which something unexpected was hidden. What we discovered was disconcerting. Those undocumented moments corresponded to a clandestine protocol that allowed the entry of unregistered people who were neither authorized staff nor identified family members. There was a parallel system, a secret route that had been used to bring in victims or even to cover the tracks of the perpetrators. Every step we took in that direction revealed new names, faces, and links that broadened our horizon and increased the risk. It was clear that those who upheld that network had enough protection to operate without fear of impunity, and we were their direct threat. The tension was palpable in the air and in the team spirit. Every finding was cautiously celebrated, aware that we were now risking not only the truth, but each person's personal safety. Uncertainty and fatigue were constant companions, but so was determination. Amid that weariness, we had to face another blow. A systematic attack on our credibility began to take shape. It was not obvious at first, but disinformation and discredit campaigns started to emerge from groups linked to the suspects. Our work went from being respected to questioned, and every publication, every report became the target of criticism and false accusations. Nonetheless, neither fatigue nor pressure managed to diminish our drive. We knew that the key to breaking down that wall was precisely to maintain transparency, rigor, and open collaboration with external actors. For that reason, we intensified social support, involving human rights organizations and coordinating public talks to denounce the situation. In those meetings, the victims' voices became the most powerful engine. Their testimonies, often broken by pain, with a true foundation that prevented everything from dissolving into bureaucracy or indifference. We felt that, although the shadows loomed over us, the light of those voices was unstoppable. It was during one of those meetings that something happened that changed the course of the investigation. A woman who had refused to speak out of fear and distrust decided to trust our team and gave us a recording exposing internal conversations between the center's leaders and external people involved in the network. Listening to those recorded voices, reality became even more cruel and tangible. There was careless talk of bribes, threats, and covert censorship. But above all, it became clear that the network was more extensive than we thought, involving even public figures who could influence political and judicial decisions. That discovery put us on high alert. We could no longer work with the same methods nor rely solely on discretion. The time had come to fully step forward, to face the consequences, and accept that this battle transcended the forensic sphere to become a social movement. We knew the risk was high, that the threats could escalate, but the need for justice and truth outweighed everything. It was a collective decision, painful but necessary. We decided to make our work public, launch a campaign to raise awareness of the case, and pressure the authorities to act with integrity and commitment. The reaction was immediate and polarizing. On one hand, we received massive support from citizens, international organizations, and committed professionals. On the other, the network we were fighting mobilized to discredit us and divert attention toward personal attacks and media campaigns. But little by little, the truth began to prevail. Independent media picked up the story. Parallel investigations came to light, and social pressure forced some involved figures to be removed from their positions and subjected to investigation. That momentum confirmed to us that justice depends not only on evidence, but also on the collective will to seek it. At the same time, we dedicated ourselves to supporting the victims in a long and delicate process. We knew that a file was not enough to repair the damage. Psychological support programs, legal advice, and meeting spaces were necessary so they could rebuild their lives and find meaning after so much suffering. This human aspect of the case was, from the start, what kept us strong in the face of adversity. Seeing that beyond science and technique, our work had contributed to restoring voice and dignity to those who seemed invisible was the greatest reward. The experience taught me that authentic justice is not limited to punishing the guilty, but also heals, protects, and transforms. I remember one afternoon, leaving the courthouse after a very tough session where the defense tried to dismantle all our evidence. I ran into a family member of one of the victims. Their grateful eyes and sincere embrace were a powerful reminder of why we had endured so much. In that gesture, there was more courage than in any judicial ruling, because it was a living expression of a humanity that had resisted abuse and sought to heal. That image remained etched in my memory as irrefutable proof that every small detail, every trace nobody noticed, could change lives deeply and irreversibly. And it was precisely that final reflection that led me to understand the true scope of that astonishing case. Because, in the end, the trace I found not only dismantled a criminal network, nor stopped the cycle of abuse. It forced me to open my eyes to a reality hidden in plain sight, to look beyond the obvious and understand that justice, to be just, must also be humane, patient, and tenacious. I learned that it's not just about finding evidence, but about listening to silence, paying attention to the small, the almost imperceptible, because the most powerful truths hide there. Today, when I think about that case, I feel a deep mixture of satisfaction and commitment. Satisfaction because we achieved a small victory amid so much darkness, and commitment because I know there is still much to do. The trace I found that time still lives within me, reminding me that in the encounter between science and soul lies the true strength to change the course of things. That justice is not a distant ideal, but a constant pursuit born, above all, from the will never to ignore details, no matter how small they seem, and always to be the voice of those who cannot be heard. Because, in the end, that tiny trace that no one noticed was the one that opened the door to truth and hope. And I know that as long as there are eyes and hands willing to search with attention and heart, no shadow can prevent justice from shining, even if with the most subtle and imperceptible light. That is a lesson I keep in the story I want to share today. A call never to underestimate the invisible, because sometimes, in the smallest things, lies the power to change everything.